Right, welcome to week 5. This week I'm adopting a slightly different approach, a recorded content lecture, and the Zoom will go ahead as normal at 5 o'clock this evening. In the Zoom I would however like to focus very much on the assessment task number 1, so I'm hopefully relying on you to bring as many questions to that Zoom session as you possibly can. Let's get started. Our topic this week is assessment in science education. So when we look at science education, let's begin. What is really happening from a science perspective when you're sitting in your chair? Well, Anders Angstrom, a Swedish physicist, had his own theory on this. We sit down, we think about comfort, we think about body contact, perhaps we can feel some bones and hips and the coccyx in there somewhere. But really Anders says, you're actually sitting on him. We're sitting on an angstrom, basically, which is the margin of 1 electron. We don't actually sit in our sofas, we levitate above them. That's a fabulous concept, isn't it? We're actually floating all the time. He measured it about 10 to the minus 10 of a metre. We may get that. It's very hard to imagine something that small. 10 to the minus 8 of a centimetre. Pretty hard to imagine. A nanometre, most of us don't have a frame of reference. And 100 picometres, well, most of us that means very little. So what I'm trying to say here is science has its own way of knowing. And if it does that, it's good for us to remind ourselves, and we put ourselves in a situation where we ask ourselves what's happening when we sit in our sofa. Science has a totally different way of interpreting that. And so when we approach our learners, we've got to understand that they are going to also have a totally unique way of interpreting what science is and what sort of science does. And that little fact at the bottom there, there are 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0 kinds of people in the world, and those who understand binary and those who do not, and that is a fact. So science has its own way of knowing, and how we assess it in learners is something that we have to open ourselves up to, the whole purpose of assessment task number 1. The introduction for this week, how we assess, and this diagram comes from Gregson, figure 8.4, and I'll just click on it at this stage. I'll click on my highlighting tool so that we can actually highlight key facts. Factors that affect how and what we assess. And we can see here that it affects on the student's learning. Okay, there's national testing, and there's assessment in the classroom. So really we've got these 3 balls floating around this funnel, and the aim as a teacher at any given time, these are enacting on our practice. But assessment has changed over time. Okay, we no longer look at just what students have learned and give it a mark. The data collected must be used to direct the actions of teachers when they plan activities and inform students about their progress. So note that assessment task number 1 also links to this, informing students about their progress, then being able to articulate that to parents, guardians, and people of interest. So hopefully by the end of the topic, here are our goals. Define assessment, describe the differences between assessment for learning, assessment of learning, and assessment as learning. So that's diagnostic, formative, and summative, and explain the different types of assessment that do exist. And we'll get into some of that as we go through. The key terms for the week is criteria. Now these mean a lot to us, completing our current assessment task. So what specific performance characteristics is an assessor taking into account when we make a judgment about your response to the different elements of a particular task? Feedback, okay, what you give back to the learner about their performance, how to target it, and what domains do you address in that feedback? Clearly their performance domains. There's also social domains. There's also emerging social domains that you probably need to comment on. Formative assessment, assessment that provides an opportunity for improvement on the same task or within the same unit. And summative assessment is a measure of the students at the end of the unit. Learning about, measuring, okay, usually at the end of a learning sequence. I think most of us are comfortable with that. Okay, assessment for you, it's about forming judgments. It's about allocating grades. Okay, but why do we do this? First of all and foremost, it's a government requirement. We diagnose learning of outcomes, and we use these to become more effective teachers. And this is really the whole point of assessment task number 1. We are looking at diagnostic assessment, learning outcomes. We use it as feedback for students and teachers. We also use assessment to grade students, and hopefully we're using assessment to motivate students, providing it's at an appropriate level. So here is the key for this one. It's a key topic. Motivating, using assessment to motivate. It must be level relevant, it must be student relevant, and it must also be appropriate. Now, we know we're haunted by the bell curve, and in many ways, this in an era where we're dealing with NAPLAN, where we're dealing with league tables, where we're looking at schools comparing each other on performance. Anyone who's had experience of teaching at 11 and 12, you'll know that some schools actually counsel students out of OP calculations, so these students don't actually impact on their school data. But when we look at a bell curve, we can see that really the majority of students do fall within the middle of that bell curve. And what we're trying to do here, and cynically, trying to replicate the curve, we are trying to teach to that large middle section. So this raises some clear issues out here and up here. And is our failure as teachers, to assess and move outside this large mainstream, is it contributing to disengagement at the upper end and at the lower end of our student cycle? Assessment types. Here's the goal for the week. Our 3 different types: assessment for learning, assessment of learning, and assessment as learning. So we're looking at these 3 different concepts as we go through this weekly material. Now, the point I'd like to make is assessment drives learning. The challenges are simple yet profound. If you wish to improve the quality of learning, you must also improve the quality of how we observe and measure learning. Now, this is coming out of Willem and Black's studies from 1995 to 1998, seminal studies, where they actually identify that formative assessment is the most influential factor in student learning. That if teachers can learn to formatively assess as they're going, they're actually able to, to influence in terms of outcome and effect, influence student learning much more than any other variable they've been able to identify in their research. And this kind of resonates with the history of science. Our ability to our science understanding has evolved as our ability to observe and measure has evolved, and so assessment goes hand in hand with this. So teaching science kind of gives us an inroad to assessment. In science education, one of the challenges at the common end of the unit term is directly related to the transmission model of learning. And what this means is, what is my content? How well am I transmitting this content? Can I open the top of my head, open the top of my students' heads, dip in a cup and pour in the knowledge? Unfortunately, many but not all of the tests tend to emphasise memorisation and low-level thinking. And bear in mind, in Queensland, since the 1990s, we've been through an era of productive pedagogies, of rich tasks. And clearly, this was the foreteller to the shift towards the Australian curriculum. And with the Australian curriculum, of course, we are trying to embed an inquiry process that works against memorisation, that tries to defeat low-level thinking, that moves towards rich tasks and productive pedagogies that teachers can apply. Professor Dennis Goodrum picks this up.
To improve the quality of learning, we must also improve the quality of how we measure learning. The focus of this resource is on supporting teachers to build on and extend their assessment practice. In science education, one of the concerns is that the common end-of-unit test is directly related to the transmission model of learning. Unfortunately, many of these tests tend to emphasise memorisation and low-level thinking. So we need to give some thought about how we can improve the quality of these summative tests. But more than that, we need to find ways that assessment can be a continuous and embedded process. As a profession, we recognise the importance of diagnostic and formative assessment. But the challenge is, how do we put these ideas into practice?
Right, a very formative challenge, a very real challenge. Let's move on and have a look. Assessment in science education. The process of observation and measurement is continuous and embedded, points made by Professor Goodrum. For effective learning, assessment also needs to be a continuous, embedded process. Considering this continuous element, we focus on 3 phases, and here is the data. Here's what we're saying: the diagnostic, formative and summative stages. In simple terms, we're talking about the beginning, the middle and end parts of an assessment cycle. Diagnostic assessment normally occurs at the start of the unit. In the medical field, there's cross-disciplinary focus here. The idea of diagnosis is to examine a person so as to determine the nature of the disease or ailment they have. And obviously following that triage, where you actually look at what needs to be done and you implement a strategy. In education, diagnostic assessment is used to determine a student's understanding of a concept or topic. Inquiry teaching then follows as an equivalent of the triage process. We work out where the misconception is, we work out how we need to treat it, we devise the strategies, the implements, we inject it with intellectual content and if you like, all kinds of antibiotics, all kinds of processes and proteins to boost the system, and in the end, hopefully, we're able to rework that misconception closer to science understandings. Let's pick this up again with another short video.
Let's start with Matt. Matt is exploring a technique for diagnostic assessment. He hopes that this technique will help him to answer the questions: where are my students starting from? How can I take this into account when planning this unit of work?
I find that diagnostic assessment is very useful when planning lessons. In the past, when I first started teaching, I didn't use it as much, and what I was finding was that I'd assume kids had prior knowledge on a topic and they didn't. So I would have gone ahead and already planned a sequence of lessons and then had to go back because the kids didn't understand some of the things that I thought they would already know coming into the lesson. So I found that since I use a diagnostic assessment first, I can work out what they really do know. I don't just have to assume it, and then I can develop my lessons to cater for the needs of the students. So first of all, I want to get a bit of an understanding of what you guys already know about the moon. I want to make sure that I'm not just teaching you things that you already know and putting you to sleep every lesson. So I'm going to ask you guys a few questions. First of all, though, to get us thinking, we want to know, why is the moon important? Okay, it sits up there in the sky. We can see it at night. It looks like it's glowing and shiny up in the sky. But why is it important? Osama, why is the moon important to you?
Because it gives us light at the night.
Okay, so it gives us light at the night. So you're saying that sometimes when there's, say, a full moon in the sky, it lights things up and you can see your way around a little bit better? Excellent. Who else? Why is the moon important to someone else? Amy, why is the moon important to you?
You know which way to go if you're lost?
All right.
After initially asking a very open question, Matt now wants to focus student attention on a particular concept.
Okay, so that's really good. You guys obviously know a little bit about the moon already, but we want to know about something in particular to do with the moon. Okay, we want to know why it looks different in the sky at different times. And I've got a bit of a cartoon that I'm going to get up on the board, and we're going to try and work out why it looks different. Why is it that one night we look at the moon and it's nice and big, the next night there's virtually no moon there, another night there might be half a moon there? Some of you might have already learnt this in primary school, some of you might not know anything about it at all. And they said, last week when I looked at the moon, it was big. Now it's only half a moon, so it's changed. And then we've got someone here that's looking up at it and they're going, I wonder how that happens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you guys to give me some ideas on why you think the moon looks different at different times, just like we did before.
Well, I find that cartoons are quite effective in eliciting responses from students, because cartoons are something that they're used to looking at home for entertainment purposes and things like that. So I find that it gets them engaged and it gets them interested. And generally, if you've got big chunks of text and writing up on the screen, students tend to switch off. They don't find it very interesting. But having a picture up there that you can refer to and then sort of promote discussion and so on from that seems to be more effective and engages the students a lot more.
So down here, Nathan's got a bit of an idea. Nathan, why do you think that it looks different at different times?
Well, the sun's on one side and you're on another, and when the sun lights up the part of the moon that it hits, and you actually see that part.
So the position of the sun and the moon, you think might have something to do with it? All right, let's write that up there. Okay, and we're not going to say if ideas are right or wrong at this stage. I wanted a whole bunch of ideas. So that was really good. You guys had some fantastic ideas there, which was really good to see. So I'm just going to save this, so I've got a copy of this, and I can look at it for my planning.
I found today there were only really a couple of kids that had a fairly good understanding of what causes the moon phases. Probably 90% of the class were fair way off, so I think there's going to be a fair bit of work to be done. Just the phases, general ideas about revolutions of the sun, earth and moon, I'm probably going to have to plan a few lessons to work on that. Well, if I was to give that same lesson again to work out what kids knew about phases of the moon, I'd probably keep most of it the same. I think that it worked fairly well. What I would maybe consider doing is getting the kids to individually work on a task at some stage. I find that working in small groups, one of the kids might persuade the other kid to agree with their ideas. So if we've got kids working in pairs, then they might have conflicting ideas. So I'd probably add a little bit where I get the individual idea, maybe an individual explanation at the end.
Right, so it's a fantastic explanation by Matt there, and that little deconstruction of his at the end of his own teaching gives us a lot of insight. I mean, we saw him use diagnostic testing there for a whole range of purposes, and one of them obviously was to motivate. We saw him calling for all answers. We don't want to limit ourselves. Let's throw up everything. And one question that's popped up through the forums and through many student emails is, how do I do? Do I teach one misconception? What do I do? Well, Matt offers you an obvious answer there. You engage in an open-ended diagnostic process where you throw up very open-ended questions, and you use that to funnel down and tune in to an area that you really want to teach. And in doing so, he's actually identified that very few of his students have comprehensive understanding about the cycles of the moon. He also identifies that he's actually probably going to have to spend additional lessons teaching related concepts in order that they can actually connect to the misconception and the content area that he really wants to target. So bear in mind, Matt is a fantastic example of how to approach assessment task number 1, of how you deal with it in a lesson sequence, and how, when you do diagnostics, it actually opens up your plans and shows you where the gaps and the holes and the blind spots are. We can talk here about socio-cultural constructivism, and here we're getting into the domain of people like Randall Pinkett. Pinkett's a great theorist, and published a lot of work in the States around 2001 to 2008, and still a follower. We talk often through ResearchGate and through other blogs, and very, very insightful researcher and also theorist. He argues that if one accepts that learning is the process of constructing understanding from experience, then it's important to have a picture of students' ideas. So many students have strong and persistent ideas, okay, and they've acquired them from experience, and their misconceptions are in there as well as their conceptions. Many of these misconceptions are based on common language, and we've talked about this constantly. Others are based on direct experience. When you observe the moon rising in the east, setting in the west, it's not unusual to assume that the sun does revolve around the earth, that it's all about me, so to speak. And this, of course, is Ptolemy's view. And of course, this changed as science began to investigate and inquire. But what we're doing is we're sorting real from book understandings. We're trying to sort the difference between real understandings and book understandings, and this requires diagnosis. Mind you, we have to be careful of book space, because book space is a very narrow world, and because we've lived in book space as teachers, we often teach from book space. But what we're not talking about book space here, we're talking about book understandings. Okay, and to get from real to book understandings, we require diagnosis. What we have to do is avoid the faking good. Now, in the forums, I've had a lot of students say, well, I'm going to stand up there and ask them what this is. What is this? What is a material? What is a chemical? What is a particle? Try to avoid that, because what you're doing is you're trying to get the right answer. You're not getting the real answer. So if you're not getting the real answer, then you're not doing diagnosis. What you're getting is faking good. And you'll find that most students will sit there anyway. The ones who don't know, they're not going to throw up their real answers, because they're sitting there saying, well, you already know this. Why are you asking us? Think about it. Put yourself in that position. So diagnostic assessment is mainly for the teacher. Don't fall into the trap of thinking it's for the student. Get them to throw up the stuff. Get them to throw out their real understandings, and avoid the faking good. Don't ask them, what is this, what is that? Don't look for the right answer. Work with what they've got. That way, you include every single student. Formative assessment, let's move on and look at this. It's primarily for the student now. We've shifted. We've gone from being the sage on the stage at stage 1, where we're looking at doing the diagnostics. We're now moving in to be the meddler in the middle, where we're sitting between the learner and their learning. Now, it's essential that the mechanism by which feedback is provided to help the student learn. Now, the idea behind formative assessment is that feedback will assist in the changes and construction of deep understandings. So, in other words, this is Vygotsky. He wrote about this in the 1920s, 1921, 1927, and I know it's published in the 70s, but he wrote about it in the 20s. He's talking about you as the more capable other, being in that zone with the less capable other, until that relationship changes. The term attempts to capture the sense that this assessment will provide information for the student's evolving concepts. While sometimes detailed feedback is important, students generally benefit from brief but continuous feedback. Questions: why are you doing that? What do you think that's going to deliver? What if you did this? Will also help the teacher adjust his or her teaching to what students are doing on the fly. Now, we heard Dennis Goodwin used that term, on the fly. It's really important that you think on your feet, and here's what formative assessment allows you to do. Simple question, why are you doing that? How is that working? The true value of formative assessment is that learning can be broken down into small steps with an assessment dimension. Okay, and that's the true value of formative assessment. Today we're looking at science inquiry skills. We're going to conduct a fair test, and in order to do the fair test we need to look at variable manipulation and definitions. Okay, so you can break it down to that stage. Okay, wait a minute, which variable did you move? Why? Which is the control variable? Getting them to actually get into the lingua franca of science, if you like. Again, we'll turn to Dennis Goodrum, and he can talk a little bit about this.
Now it's time to meet Kim. Kim is partway through an energy and ecosystems unit and wants to check where her students' thinking is at. Note how Kim plans to repeat the assessment task in a few weeks' time. This will provide evidence of how students' thinking has changed by the learning opportunities that are provided. Kim is using this technique to help her answer the questions: how are the students progressing as the unit of work unfolds? Where do they need constructive feedback, additional support, or challenge? Where does the unit of work need to be modified on the fly to best address student needs?
I'm actually about to start a new bit of a section of ecology, and I want to actually know what the students know already about the topic. I don't actually want to spend too long on material that they already know, that they've had exposure to. So in order to do a bit of a pre-test, I'm going to use a concept map for that purpose, diagnostically. And then I'll come back to the students and do another concept map down the track so I can see the progression between their understanding of concepts now and later. And hopefully my teaching methodology will enable any gaps to be plugged that I am aware of when I have a look at those first concept maps. So I'm going to start up a concept map on the board here just to interrelate these factors that we came up with yesterday, and then we're going to move on to a concept map using some more words and develop the ideas further.
Kim uses some concepts with which students are already familiar to model how to construct a concept map.
That population has needs, and those needs are abiotic factors. The link between population and abiotic factor, okay, I'm going to draw an arrow like that, and I'm just going to put needs, all right, population needs abiotic factors. We've named some abiotic factors there, so we've got, for example, examples of abiotic factors. Oxygen might be an example. So I'm just going to put aerobic respiration here. So I'm making the links between the words, one idea or one concept and another. I'm putting a line, and on that line or on that arrow I'm putting the link. All right, so then I'm building up a concept map. We're actually moving to extend our concept map into relationships between the abiotic factors and the biotic factors in the environment. And I need to know how much you know about biotic factors so that I can plan the next few lessons. All right? Some of you might know quite a lot from primary school and from year 8. Some of you might not know all of the ideas yet, so I want to just get a picture of that so that I know how to plan.
Competition relates to predation, doesn't it? Because
competition would be in the food chain other than the food web, because competition is basically there's one food source and two people want it.
yeah, but wouldn't competition be predation would come under competition?
We said that biotic is to do with living, all right, but we're not talking about, you know, living, non-living, dead anymore. We're talking about living and non-living.
Yeah.
So non-living factors rather than dead factors, okay? All right.
Although unintended, this exercise resulted in good formative assessment of the previous work done on abiotic factors.
What does abiotic mean?
Abiotic are physical features. So we've got things like temperature, nutrients, oxygen, currents. It's physical factors that affect a living thing in its habitat. I wanted to use this diagnostically. I think that the students weren't as far on in their understanding as I actually thought they were.
And what is bio?
That's where we've got relationships between living things. So, for example, the relationship between a parrot and the food that it eats. For example, in the morning, you know, I see this whole flock of parrots come down for the olives that grow on the olive tree near me, and that's a relationship between the biotic components of the environment. Yeah. Okay. All right. I was a bit nonplussed when they actually didn't know the difference between abiotic and biotic factors, which is something that we have gone over very quickly. For me, that's an insight into the fact that I haven't probably taught that topic or that lead up very well, and I need to remediate that.
See the CD-ROM for further information and practice about how concept map.
Now we can see from that particular example, and you know, the reason why I threw in Kim's scenario there, and these are available on Science by Doing, but let's face it, many of us in this course are actually teaching to the primary level. You can find yourself into a P10 or P12 school where you may actually inherit some upper school levels or middle school science levels. And so it's really important to see these principles in practice. Now, clearly you can also imagine scaling this down to primary and lower primary levels. But the notion of a concept map, and can I just connect this, please, to the notion, you know, one of the assessment criteria in assessment task number 1 about reporting to parents. Now, imagine if you had a before concept map and an after concept map, and you were able to sit down with the learner in a conference and talk about the differences and the learning between them and where the student has progressed, what attributes are emerging. You can then use that too with the parents when you sit down. And this is what we mean by how are you going to report on the learning from your learning sequence in assessment task number 1. I don't mean posting it to you know, one school as a grade, from E through to A. That's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is how you can actually report about learning. So how are you going to build that in? And in the forums this week, you know, I do offer some suggestions on how that can be done, and give you some interesting work from New Zealand where it's a very embedded and very frequent process. Formative assessment. Let's have a look at another example.
Rosemary has followed a similar procedure to design an investigation using a cotton reel racer.
How did we transfer that energy? Connor, can you tell us how this transferred energy?
Yeah, it moved along the ground.
And how did it do that?
Like the force from the lucky band pushed it.
Okay, so if I just put this down like that, I can't see that the force is pushing it.
No, you have to twist the thing around first.
Okay, you have to twist this around. Okay, excellent. And Kyle, you had an idea of what happened when it started to untwist?
Potential energy transferred to kinetic energy.
Potential energy that was in the elastic band transferred to kinetic energy. Excellent. For our data that we have, the best graph might be what, Jasmine?
The line graph.
The line graph. Who can tell me maybe a reason why it might be the best type of graph? Nick?
So we can see the change on how much the distance increases with the number of twists or the variable.
Okay, so we're looking at doing 2 sets of data and we're looking at the change, but what else might it be?
We're using decimals.
Okay, so when we are using decimals, we actually call this continuous data. So if we've got data that can go up by little bits, it's too hard to draw our bar and column graphs, which are discrete data. I really wanted them to understand why we graph the way we do and how to graph, and that, you know, all of the appropriate pieces of equipment that we need for graphing, and that it does take time and it needs to take care with, you know, what you're doing. Plus, I also wanted them to understand that another way of representing some data other than a table was in graphical format. And I wanted them to see how they could do that themselves from their own experiments, so using a real sort of life investigation.
Let's just hear what Rosemary has to say about formative assessment. Now, she doesn't actually use that term, but that is what she is describing.
So what I'm going to be doing is obviously collecting the work. I've collected it once just to have a look at it already and see where they were going. And what I was able to do there is, if there were a few kids that had problems with variables or anything, predictions, etc., up to the point, and they did have some problems with hypotheses, that I was able to go over that with them. And then I provided them with their work back. We've gone through it again, and I'll have another look at the work and provide some feedback to them, either individually if it's only one person that's having an issue, or I can provide that, you know, like doing an example on the board, like this is what you might have thought you did, this is really how we're supposed to do it, or some people did it this way and others did it that way. So I'm showing them also different ideas, so it's ongoing sort of feedback for them. And then when I collect this work at the end, because I've had that input with them, so when I go to market, they would have had an opportunity to get to put in my suggestions or any suggestions that I've given the whole class into their work, so that when they're handing their final product in, it should be hopefully of a higher quality than it would have been if I hadn't been providing that ongoing feedback.
So that's a really interesting example again, isn't it, of formative assessment in practice. And again, we can see here how it's translating through the inquiry process, where she's building formative assessment in now to also target science inquiry skills. So it's not just knowing about, it's also knowing how. And the whole data logging stuff, the questions she's asking there about continuous data versus discrete data, little things that we probably don't think we would do, you know, in terms of how is the best way to illustrate or to represent your findings. And yet these clearly are outcomes that we need to address in our teaching of science. Outcomes that sit comfortably and sometimes uncomfortably under the inquiry skills component. So when we look at a summative assessment, it usually occurs at the end of a unit of study, and essentially it's a summary of what and how well the student has learned. Now in assessment task number 2, we actually get to look at formative and assessment and summative assessment in some depth. You know, you're going to have to analyse 2 continuous units of study, and we'll get to that probably in the coming weeks. Now information from summative assessment is often converted into a grade measurement. This grade is reported. Yet, you know, the grade is an outcome, it's a summary, it's a representation, it's a symbol. Now, in an iconic world, the symbol represents a level of achievement, but the information that we can get from conferencing, you know, the reporting of learning to learners is much more important than a grade. So it's commonly associated with end-of-unit tests. There's 2 key principles. A test must be, the summative assessment must be quality. It must be important to have fewer quality assessment items that effectively determine and discriminate between concepts and measure the student's understanding, rather than having lots of items with a similar tendency to only measure the student's memory. So it's going deeper rather than further. Another important principle is that of variety. You need to embed a variety of techniques so that you as a teacher be confident the student has understood the science ideas. So if you're just testing students using multiple choice every time, you probably find the first series of runs, but over repeated measures in multiple choice tests, you probably find student grades dropping off, purely because they get bored with the concept. There's a lack of stimulation. It's not connected to motivation in any way, only for students who are diagnosed as high achievers, and that represents, you know, probably between 8 and 11% of any student population at best. Summary of assessment purpose, and I'll just use my highlighter here to move into this discussion. We can see that there's a range of different summary types, and what I'll do is I'll post out to you all a little document make available to you on descriptors for assessment. So you can see there's a whole range of different assessment types. So when you're talking about how are you going to report learning, here you've got a whole range of strategies. You know, you can actually get work samples of self-assessment and reporting. We can get portfolios. We can link a portfolio to an interview, which is a fabulous thing to do, and sit down and talk about, you know, even the summative. You can grade them across a variety. Interview then becomes summative when you combine these 2 items together. Concept maps before and after can therefore be diagnostic, formative and summative. We can look at notebooking, okay, and if you build in some self-assessment there, okay, into your notebooking, we can actually turn that also into a summative task. Rubrics are fabulous, okay. Again, the problem with teaching and using a rubric as your assessment criteria is ultimately that you're going to have to teach that rubric first. You're going to actually explain and deconstruct what the rubric is actually testing and reviewing. And peer review, of course, can be extremely useful around about the formative stage. So all of these strategies that you can build in, but you can only build them in when learners have a sufficiently clear picture of what they're meant to attain through their learning. So what is the target? You know, so if you're explicit about your target, if your teaching is aligned, and here again in the forum this week we raised John Biggs' work of constructive alignment. If your teaching is aligned to your strategy, to your outcomes, then students will have a clear understanding of where they're going with their learning. So there are a range of different assessment tasks. There are a range of different purposes for which they can be used. consider them, and you can also transform these by adding them together, pairing them together, or altering and reconstructing them. So, you know, you can mess around with assessment and create really, really specific tools that, you know, blend different approaches and lead to better outcomes. So what the experts say, we've got Hackling 2000, and he's lobbying very, very much towards a portfolio approach. He thinks work samples is the most effective way to go. And here we've got Black and Willem, self-assessment. Okay, they see it as an essential component of formative assessment. So teaching students to self-correct. Now, anyone who's taught or anyone who's had to learn a second language, that you know that the key to teaching language is error detection. Now, we can actually extrapolate this into cognitive learning. The key to teaching learning is, or metacognition, is to detect error. Detect error. Now, psychotherapy uses this principle too when we look at cognitive-based psychology. You know, CBT. What is erroneous in my thoughts? What impact is that having on my life? So self-assessment is a very, very powerful tool. And I agree with Black and Willem. If you can build it in, if you can empower a learner to become self-assessing, then you're achieving some really good outcomes. Transferability means transferring learning, and Wiggins sees this as absolutely essential. So adept at applying them to increasingly complex and complicated contexts. So for Wiggins, you know, the best assessment is a continuum, which starts with something simple and moves to the domain of the complex. The National Curriculum Board, assessment should serve the purpose of learning first and foremost. It should encourage longer-term understanding, not memory, note, understanding. And the provision of detailed diagnostic information should support student learning. It should show what students know, what they understand, and what they can demonstrate. And then, it should also what they need to do to improve. We look at Harlan here. Again, look around the time all of these are published. Remember, at the time Australia was having a rethink of its education system. All skills have to be used in some context and are only scientific if they are applied in the context of science. Okay, so he's again saying specific skills, specific context. Okay, which is a really important thing to do, and we saw that applied very well in the last video example. And the present emphasis in secondary schooling on traditional testing that focused on the extent to which students memorise and recall. It's a little bit critique of this, and you see it's Dennis Goodrum, Hackling and Rennie, and they published a lot of papers between 2001, 2008 and even up to 2012, and where they're looking at traditional assessment practices as a barrier to science learning. So we're looking at something more innovative and something more real world and authentic. So you're asking, how do we get NAPLAN? I think it's a bloody good question. Assessment of the assessment curriculum takes place at different levels and for different purposes. Now here we've got the government. You know, we can't deny the government. They're a stakeholder in education. So we've got ongoing formative assessment classrooms for the purpose of monitoring. We've got summative assessment for the purpose of twice yearly reporting by schools, parents and carers. Okay, so that's mandatory. We've got these components. We've got the annual testing, years 3, 5, 7 and 9, of levels of achievement, literacy, numeracy, okay, and some obviously general knowledge as well. This produces useful national information. However, it can be taken too far. You know, information is very much, and results are very much contingent on performance at one point in time. And I'm a huge critic of extrapolating too much from that data other than its performance at one point in time. And now what we're seeing is this growing phenomenon of teachers teaching to the test, compared, you know, with the actual challenge of improving literacy and numeracy, which again, in the most recent NAPLAN testing, actually shows that literacy and numeracy for most client groups in the NAPLAN categories actually went backwards. Okay? And this also rips away from time spent on other areas in class. Poetry, art, wonder, awe, green versus grey. All of these wonderful things that we as teachers are left to wonder how we now include in our repertoires of practice. So when we plan for assessment, you know, John Biggs talks about constructive alignment. We've got to identify our key intended learning outcomes. Step 1. Step 2, we've then got to align our assessment tasks with these intended learning outcomes. And step 3, design student activities to provide opportunities to meet and develop these outcomes. Now this essentially is assessment task number 1. You've done your diagnostics, so you've identified the key learning outcomes. You've then tailored those diagnostics towards, in your learning sequence, assessment tasks, formative assessment tasks that are going to help you address those. And that doesn't have to be on a lesson basis. It can be, for instance, the exploratory stage, the redescribing stage, and the application stage as Loxley uses it. We can then design student learning activities. Okay, so your strategies to reach the full range of those intended outcomes. So we can start with misconceptions. We can identify our key concept. We can align assessment around that key concept to teach the structure and content and knowledge, the ways of knowing, and then we can design activities to embed, support, and manage those. And a really simple way of completing your learning sequence or analysing your learning sequence is the simple unit plan from Science by Doing. What is your assessment planning for the unit? Description of what techniques and strategies you're going to use, when and why it will be used. And this is an important point to answer for assessment task number 1. Why are you doing what you are doing? Now don't leave it there for your marker to see it as explicit. Come out and say, why are you doing what you're doing? And Paula had a wonderful question in the forum around that. Now, do I have to explain why I'm doing the diagnostic I'm doing? You don't have to. I mean, you can let it go and you can miss the opportunity to get those marks. Or you can include it, because it really is about constructive alignment. It's part of this process. And what is the purpose for including it? So some people said, do I need to do a lesson plan? Well, the answer is no. We are much more interested in this assessment task in your assessment planning. So what are you looking at for the unit? What is the assessment technique or strategy you're going to use? When will you use it? And the purpose for including it in your strategy. So in assessment task number 1, identify the misconception. Link your assessment techniques and strategy to your teaching, and then design activities that are going to bring these to life. Okay, that is assessment task number 1. Before you submit assessment task number 1, a little bit of a checklist for you. Have I considered the following aspects? And look, this is very generic. It comes from the Science by Doing website, but it's got really, really good application to what we're doing here. Have I actually done a diagnostic? I've included tasks to uncover misconceptions. Have I incorporated a number of assessment strategies to test these out? What have I used? Have I used questions? Have I used cartoons? Have I used flashcards? What have I done? Okay, in my lesson sequence, have I included opportunities going to give the learners multiple opportunities to demonstrate understandings and skills? Am I assessing both understanding and skills? Science understandings and science inquiry? Is it explicit what I'm doing? And go on, further and further. Am I targeting higher order thinking skills? Through the redescribe and application stage. Where are the opportunities for feedback to learners? How do I ensure that what I'm doing is on track? Now, in your learning sequence, I'm asking you to make educated guesses. You haven't done the sequence, so you can't ensure. But how do you know that your learning sequence, and how are you demonstrating and commenting in assessment task number 1, that your learning sequence is actually going to guide your teaching? Okay, it's really important. What steps will you take? What opportunities will they get to demonstrate mastery of concepts and process skills? Self-assessment. Peer assessment. Is there space? Is there scope for that? What can be gained from it? And have you actually shared your unit of work with a peer? Have you had someone review it for you and say, look, I can see an obvious gap there, or wow, I really like the way you've done this? Often we take our assessment and we think, fantastic, I finished, up to Moodle it goes, and the only 2 people that see it are you and your marker. Why not workshop it? Why not send it out to peers and colleagues, and why not get some comment and feedback on it? Alright, hopefully I'll see you all at the Zoom session tonight, or as many of you as possible, given that this assessment task is due on Thursday. Alright, good luck, and any questions please post to the forum.